Good morning, everyone. Dr. James Lyons-Weiler coming to you live from the WWDNYK studios in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We live in a very information-rich world, and sometimes some things can fall through the cracks. And I wanted to be sure that today's guests and his work didn't fall through the cracks, because you really need to know about Michael Diamond's thinking. You really need to know about how the U.S. government has a duty, and a singular duty at that, under the Constitution by his assessment. And so we're going to be talking with Dr. Michael Diamond, Mr. Michael Diamond, about this particular article here, Ending Corporate Tyranny, Solutions to the Plague That Afflicts Us All. And it's particularly relevant to things that are happening today, because we have, for instance, just heard in the news that Dr. Fauci knew about the false positive rate with the tests for SARS-CoV-2 way back in April. He was warned by Dr. Singhang Lee in a letter in which Dr. Lee pointed out that we are flying blind, that the national agenda for testing for SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus is actually founded on a very, very bad principle. And, I'm currently researching ways to help us get out of that, specifically with the scientific research that I do. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. So let me bring on Michael Diamond. Michael, thanks for being on Unbreaking Science. How are you, sir?
I'm fine. It's my pleasure, and thank you for being interested in my work.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mary Holland put us together over a draft article that you were seeking some feedback on, and you ended up publishing it in Covert Action magazine, which I think is a fantastic article. If you're a freedom-loving American, well, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, you need to hear Michael's thesis. This is the particular article. Again, I'll flash it. People can find it and read it. Ending Corporate Tyranny, Solutions to the Plague That Afflicts Us All, Covert Action magazine. What's the main point here? What is it? How is the relationship between the public, corporations, and the government askew in the United States today, and how do we fix it?
Well, what I found in my working life, I was a lawyer in private practice. I began the practice in 1965. By 1980, I took a job at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And it was there that I had a first unbelievable look at the regulatory systems that exist within the United States. I was in charge of of enforcement of all of the water pollution laws in New Jersey. And what I saw there was heartbreaking. We, the people, were not protected by the laws that were created, environmental laws, health laws. We weren't protected then. We aren't protected now. We have been given over to corporate control, where corporations were favored and they were assisted and they were served by people in government, people in power, essentially captured. That's a legal term.
Mm-hmm.
Captured the government structures and the media, gave us the impression that we were being protected, and we were not. I left government service in 1981. I was dazed, D-A-Z-E-D, dazed by the harm that was being done to the public without people knowing, without people being able to do something about it. So I began looking for any place I could. I began looking for ways within which to stop the harms that people were undergoing. And that's when I came across Article 4, Section 4 in the United States Constitution. And that is called the Guarantee Clause. And it It is the feature of the work that I've been doing ever since. That's the clause that the framers of the Constitution meant for us to look at, use, understand, in order for us to survive. And there's no question in my mind that that's what has to be done immediately, because there's not much time. Things are going in the direction of omnicide. Omnicide is not a word that people use, know about. It's not, you don't find it in print, but omnicide means that this earth is going toward total destruction.
So let's talk about Article 4, Section 4. In your article, you say that Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts during the Lincoln administration referred to the article as Section 4 as a sleeping giant in the Constitution. What is the domestic violence clause about? What does it mean?
It's the clause that the framers, it was the fulcrum for the Constitutional Convention in 1787. What happened was the country had created a constitution 10 years before under the Articles of Confederation, and the country was heading for a downfall. It had no central government with powers to protect the people, to take care of invasion, to take care of emergency matters. The federal government under Articles of Confederation was nothing more than a debating society. So that in the 10 years there was a constitutional convention that was called for in Philadelphia. And at that time, a gentleman by the name of Edmund Randolph rose on the first day, the first hour of business, and he began talking about a condition of domestic violence in the United States, in this country, that was so significant that we have to deal with it as the number one priority at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The result was stunning because every delegate was sent to the convention to repair the Articles of Confederation. They knew that when Edmund Randolph spoke about domestic violence and the country, the downfall of the United States was imminent, they knew that they had to create a new constitution, and the focus, the absolute focus, was the domestic violence clause. It was meant for us to use to get us out of any emergencies that we would create in terms of harming ourselves. Well, the explosion of chemical exposures, and I mean that by an explosion in 1946, brought about a condition of domestic violence that the framers would have us understand and use that clause in order to have the central government take over using military powers to stop the people who were doing the harms, those among us who have created this, what would you call it? A cascade of difficulties.
Sure. So there's something like 4,000 unregulated chemicals that are out there that are in common use, or 40,000, some huge number of chemicals that are out there. And we know nothing about their synergistic toxicity. We know nothing about what they're doing to our reproductive capacity, next to nothing. And when we do know something, such as when Terry Rubik did the study that showed that the quaternium ammonium compounds, reduce the fertility of mice in the lab by 50%, and it lasts for 2 generations, right? And that 15% of the mice that were born in her lab exposed to this cleaner, the quat cleaners that are being used all over the place in the United States without proper testing on our children, 15% of those pups had neural tube defects, the ones that survived. So I just wanted, for the listeners and the viewers, I want to read Section 4 which reads Article 4, Section 4, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion on the application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. Now, roughly interpreted, that would mean that the executive branch is empowered to police attacks against United States citizens and its institutions. Is that right?
Well, what we have to do is take Section 4. You read it in its entirety. And we have to get rid of the language that's unnecessary. So if we get rid of a republican form of government, because that's not crucial to what our conversation is today, and we take the words and shall protect each of them, and transpose the people, because there's a Supreme Court case that says each of them means the people. It's the people who deserve protection, not the state governments.
Yeah.
So if we let go those words about the executive when the legislature cannot be convened, because legislatures are so easily convened in the 21st century. It used to be that one would have to travel by horse from one part of the state to another, and an emergency might happen quickly. So getting rid of all of the verbiage that's not necessary, Article 4, Section 4 breaks down into these words. On application of the state legislatures, the United States shall protect the people from domestic violence.
They're not doing their job.
No, you were talking about exposures that affect
fertility,
the ability to transfer life from one generation to the next. The exposures, hormone disruptors affect infertility. Human sperm and egg has been dramatically harmed. And what I began to see when I was working within the structure was that autism. In my lifetime, and I was born in 1939, autism in my lifetime went from what some people consider 1 in 10,000 births. 1 in 10,000. Autism now in many of the states is down to 1 in 40 births, 1 out of every 40 births.
Yes, 1 in 25 in New Jersey. Mm-hmm.
And those exposures that you were mentioning, if they are not stopped, then 1 out of every other child will be born on the autistic spectrum. And that's the emergency that we have. And remember, take advantage of the fact that I'm old, because I remember the 1940s. I don't remember one single child with cancer, asthma, autism, difficulties with allergies. I went to different schools, and when the kids didn't like the lunch, they went to a table and they got peanut butter and jelly. I don't remember one child ever harmed or having to be brought back to life as a result of a peanut allergy. And the major media, they don't talk about this. They don't talk about the history of what's going on. And maybe the worst of it is that when I was working in Trenton, I came upon people who were talking about these exposures affecting educability.
Yeah.
These exposures affecting impulse control.
Yep.
And what I found was those few people who would talk about that were were the targets of industry. Targets.
Right.
One of the people that I came to know about was Dr. Herbert Needleman.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Herbert Needleman, University of Pittsburgh, right where you are.
Yep.
He began to understand that children that had lead exposures were far more likely to be they had lower test scores and had impaired impulse control. And so he made these wonderful studies using their teeth, the teeth that they
Mm-hmm.
grew up with. And he found that lead exposures were a significant thing in saving us from a society that will be something less than what it should be. And I read his obituary. He died some years ago, and he said that industry went after him. He was shut out of his own laboratory. His own file cabinets were shut to him because it was claimed that he was perpetrating a fraud. And
So basically, scientific misconduct is what you're talking about. But it was not true. Everyone now knows that lead is a serious problem.
and lead and cadmium and aluminum and fluoride, they're all it's all part of a cascade of harms. And it's the domestic violence clause that, if we take it seriously, that will allow us to get ahead of the curve and stop the progress toward destruction of humanity. By the way, Rene Dubos said it best. I wrote about Dubos. Dubos said that we are exquisitely fragile. Humans are exquisitely fragile. And he said that if we don't begin to change the way in which we stop chemical exposures from reaching us, we might tolerate in the short run environmental stresses, but if we don't regulate the exposure, first there would be increases in disease. Second, and far more menacing to Dubos, there would be, quote, distortions of mental and emotional attributes. He predicted that unless we used our human genetic limitations as a standard, we would begin to see, near the turn of the 20th century, development of a form of life that will retain little of true humanness. We are heading there, and we simply have to understand that it's got to be stopped. Now, the way in which to stop it.
Well, before we get to the how to stop it, here's what I want to say. I want to say there's a couple of layers of problems here. We have the problem of the actual cascade of chemicals that are introduced to the environment every day. There's more and more chemicals introduced every year. The regulation, as you mentioned, is captured. With enough money, a corporation could just arrange it so that they're paying a fine. The fine is minuscule, $50,000 for a fine, where they're making millions and millions of dollars by poisoning the environment, poisoning plants and animals, water, the air, human beings. And I'm glad that you brought up lead in the context of Pittsburgh, because when Flint, Michigan was discovered to have high lead amounts in their water, that was a transient problem because they had changed the flocculant in the water and the lead level spiked. In fact, the water was undrinkable. It was browned. No one in Flint, Michigan would actually cook or drink with this water. You couldn't possibly have used it. So but it was found in Pittsburgh that the lead in the water in Pittsburgh, even though in the city of Pittsburgh, in the poor neighborhoods, was so contaminated with lead that the lead levels in the water there were higher than those in Flint, Michigan.
Wow.
Higher than those in Flint, Michigan. And we called out the Department of what was it, the Allegheny County Board of Health for not doing anything about this for the past 30 years. In the meantime, at the same time, they're trying to push mandated HPV vaccines that have this strange form of aluminum as an adjuvant in it that no one really knows the health effects of. We called them out. So they went back to the University of Pittsburgh and they brought out somebody from the Graduate School of Public Health to talk at a press conference. The degree of concern in the Allegheny County Board of Health at the time, which reflects they're a body that's empowered by the legislature, which reflects the policy. They're the policy branch of the legislature by virtue of the extension of those powers that they're given. Was the effect where this public health official stated that no one needs to worry about the lead in the water because there's more lead in the paint in these old homes and in the soil around these old homes than there is in the water. And the obvious gaffe there is it's absolutely it's either disingenuous or shows ignorance or a lack of caringness. It's callous disregard for the fact that lead exposure is cumulative. You take the lead from the water, you add it to the lead from the soil, and the lead to the paint, and these are African American communities in the city of Pittsburgh. All right. So then, okay, so what are we going to do about that? Well, what they decided to do about that was that they're going to replace over 20 years. That's what the law requires. Over 20 years, they were going to replace, 1/20th of the lines, the water lines. But they had 20 years to do it. And that wasn't good enough. And we raised a stink, and then the company themselves realized, the water company themselves realized that they're going to have a huge PR problem. So they worked overtime, and they've been replacing a huge portion every year, and then coronavirus came. I have no idea what the effect has been on that. But this callous disregard and the first thing they do is they say, okay, yeah, we're the public health authorities. So they put on their badge of authority. They show up in front of a microphone and they say, we've got this under control, nothing to worry about here, through denialist agenda. That's a big part of the regulatory capture. Don't look here. There's nothing to see here. Everybody go home. We have this under control. And that's where the American public has to stand up and say, no, it's out of control. And Michael, that's what you're saying. It is out of control. And what I said earlier is, it says, or the executive when the legislature cannot be convened. So I would argue if the legislature is not doing anything about these problems, they're not convening over this problem, then the executive branch should step in somehow. Is that your point?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the executive is what the framers meant to have us focus on. I know that they meant to have us focus on the legislature.
Let's take a look at what that looks like. So it says specifically on the application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot convene against domestic violence. What that looks like is the FBI. It looks like sheriff's departments. It looks like police. Somebody files a complaint against the police department about poisoning of the environment, and the executive branch acts accordingly because it's an attack on the people. That's what an executive action would look like, right?
Well, yes, and I would say you're absolutely right about the executive branch operating and the governors operating, but that might be separate from the domestic violence clause. And I love your words. You're talking about. Please help me with what you said. The fault on the part of the corporations. You call that a failure of was it a moral failure or a
callous disregard. There was callous disregard. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, callous disregard. Transpose callous disregard into criminality.
Right.
So that at the same time,
callous disregard can be criminal. That's the point.
Right.
Right.
What I'm saying is, at the same time we look at the remedy of the domestic violence clause, I also talk in the article about the use of criminal law. And I believe that what you're talking about in terms of callous disregard is criminality.
Absolutely. So the example that I would give here that makes it really simple for people is, imagine that you're a surgeon and for whatever reason you decide that you're going to continue to use the same surgical instruments from patient to patient without sterilizing them. Not
Right.
only it wouldn't take an act of legislation, it wouldn't take a Senate committee. What it would take is a call to the local sheriff's office to have you arrested because you're causing infections and killing people through callous disregard. That's what an executive action looks like. And anyone, my point is, anyone can file a police report. We're not
Yeah.
Americans tend not to use our ability and power as individuals to actually invoke the executive branch of government. We tend to steer clear of it. We don't want to get mixed up in it. I mean, and the police oftentimes, like in cases of domestic violence, will try to convince the victim. They'll do everything that they can convince the victim to not get something started. You're sure that you want to file, and they're just they disregard domestic violence. This also includes child abuse. And so I'm not the kind of person that calls the police on my neighbors right at the first moment of trouble, or, I don't want the police arresting everybody. But the point is, a few well selected case examples of a CEO doing a perp walk in front of the news cameras for poisoning entire schools and poisoning an entire environment. And like we've seen up in Michigan, there are criminalities aspects to what was done, but ironically, the criminality went to the denialism of the problem in the government, as opposed to the corporations that are running the water supply up there. So there seems to be this magic halo effect of corporations. Their defense you might agree with me that their defense is we answer to our shareholders. We can't act in the common good. We answer to the profit motive. We have to by law answer to our shareholders if they're a traded company. But I'm jumping ahead. So go ahead. You had a thought on callous disregard.
Okay. So at the same time that I talk about the domestic violence clause, I talk about active use of the criminal law to go after uh, heads of corporations who have done things that have been um, harm for profit, like the oil companies that knew 30 years ago that we should be changing over from fossil fuels to solar and other forms of energy creation. They purposely uh, put um, trolls trolls into the public discussion to put out false information,
Sure.
propaganda. Now that is fraud. Not only is it fraud, but it's probably a form of treason, which is punishable under the Constitution. That's Article 3, Section 3. Treason consists of levying war. Levying war means harming uh, other citizens,
Mm-hmm.
and when you do it for purposes of deferring proper use of public health initiatives, then it's probably treason under the United States Constitution, and it's certainly fraud. So that the domestic violence clause and the criminal laws can and should be used vociferously. People have to get themselves in front of grand juries. Grand juries are people just like you and me.
Yeah.
And when they begin to know the things that you know, they will begin to indict not just corporations, but individuals within corporations who knew the harm that they were doing with putting out one product and another, and simply refused to stop doing the harm. And I know in Ending Corporate Tyranny, I quote a book where an attorney by the name of Bilot uh, sued the DuPont Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
And the DuPont Corporation knew that they were putting out a product that was harming people, and they wouldn't stop. Well, that's criminality, that's treason, that's and anyone who knows about a treason that's taking place would be guilty of misprision of treason, which is 18 U.S. Code 2382, if they didn't come forward. The existence of a misprision of treason statute allows the use grand jury indictments against people who commit that kind of crime makes it rather easy, because anyone who has knowledge of the commission of any treason and actively come forward to disclose that information, is guilty of misprision of treason. So in other words, the people have all kinds of armamentary arms, legal arms to use. And when they begin to understand what the domestic violence clause is, let me give you some example of what the domestic violence clause can do. Is that all right? Can I jump to that, or?
Go right ahead. Yeah, that's what we're here for.
Okay. I was born in Newark, New Jersey. Newark had a terrible problem of harms to black citizens. It was so vicious and so long. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Kerner Commission came out and talked about that viciousness. What fueled the riots? The riot in Newark. Riots took place in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Riots took place in the 1960s all over the nation, all over the country. And they were out of control, fueled by the vehement racial operations of the police department in Newark.
Yep.
The government of New Jersey called upon the federal government to use the domestic violence clause to stop the harms from taking place. And so tanks came into the streets of Newark. Companies like Prudential and Kresge's and Bamberger's, they couldn't stay open if they wanted to. They couldn't, because martial law was called, martial law.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lockdown. And there were troops that were brought in to bring about order. And that is the power of the domestic violence clause. And what I'm saying is that corporations that use their power to harm us to the point that omnicide is taking place, that the downfall of civilization is taking place, those corporations can be stopped using the power of the domestic violence clause. They can be unhorsed. The power can be taken away. It was a terrible mistake to begin with when we gave corporations the power of citizens. And that can be changed, altered by the domestic violence clause. And the process is that people like you and I have to go before the states. Upon application of the state legislatures, the United States shall protect us against domestic violence.
That's a good
point. So we have to go to the states. And when we go to the states, what we tell them is, you have an obligation to educate and to assure the citizens of your state safety.
Right.
Well, you can't possibly educate citizens of your state if every other child is born on the autistic spectrum. You can't possibly bring about safety if people no longer have adequate reserves of impulse control. And so the result is that you have to begin listening to us in your committees, and you have to begin understanding that you, states of New Jersey and Pennsylvania and the rest of are being played for fools, because the kind of resources that are needed to bring about the change are resources that rival the military budget. In the meantime, you, states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, you have allowed your children to be taken into the military, to be used as cannon fodder, for corporate control of the resources of the world. And you, state of New Jersey, state of Pennsylvania, have to stop doing that, because every dollar that goes into the military now has to go into assuring public health, stopping the warming of the planet, the weather that's out of control. You're not going to be able to deal with that, state of New Jersey or Pennsylvania, because you, like a family, have to live on a budget. You can't create money. You have to deal with this agenda that the corporations have put in place. And so the only way that you can do it is by listening to us, you and I, and coming to the conclusion that you, state of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Arkansas, Alabama, you have to call upon the United States government to protect us. We can afford war no more. We have to do absolute control over the corporations. They turned out to be Frankenstein monsters, as Justice Louis Brandeis said that they were, because, and you referred to it before, they have an obligation to their shareholders to maximize profits.
Right.
That's inconsistent with the duties that we have to care for our citizens, protect us when we're in a situation of domestic violence.
I think it's a very important message. That's why I have you on today. Listen, my viewers are born skeptics on every issue, and so the pushback on this is, kind of the defeatism, right? Which is, listen, are we really going to turn to a legislature when the legislature, the corporations are in the back pocket through donations to the campaign? Their campaign, pharma, for instance, gives every new congressman $1 million on their first day. It's like comes in a blue envelope, and it's like, okay, you answer to us now. You got to drink this Kool-Aid, and if you don't drink the Kool-Aid, you're going to be $1 million short of the next guy that's going to run against you to replace you in office. I would challenge any public health official, but already speaking with you and reading your article, my approach towards public comments when I do the circuit again and talk with them about the risk of injuries from vaccines is to put the onus on them. You have to explain to us the toxicity of aluminum. I presented you the science. It's your duty to understand this. I'm here to tell you that the science is there, and it's your duty to understand it, and it's your duty to communicate those risks as well as the risks of any attendant infection from vaccine-preventable diagnoses from vaccines. It's your duty to do this. And the corporations have captured not just the U.S. Congress and Senate, but they've captured the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. Because by virtue of finagling it so the HHS becomes the defendant in the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, and the HHS administers the same Justice Department, which if you'll notice, that's a problem because we don't have separation of powers, the HHS being an executive branch, and they administer the NVICP, which is a judicial body. There's a lack so the corporations, including the medical community, they want to police themselves. They want to set up their own policing structures like medical boards that say, no, if you're a surgeon and you have contaminated instruments and you don't clean it up, the medical board will take care of you. We'll just take your license away. When was the last time that you heard of a doctor that willfully poisoned, say that doctor up in Michigan, that willfully poisoned and intentionally poisoned patients that didn't even have cancer, some of them who died? He was never charged with murder. He was never charged with manslaughter. He was given a 75-year prison sentence and his license was removed. But that was murder. That was intentional. If I took the same poisons and put them into, someone that I knew, and I don't have a medical degree, I would be charged with murder, hands down. So there seems to be this understanding, if you will, between government and corporations that, you know what, we're gonna, as long as business keeps going. And the other point that I wanted to make is the nature of capitalism is, even as the plane is descending and it's in a steep dive and it's crashing, new industries pop up that capitalize on things like autism. New industries capitalize on things like vaccine injury. The inability of people to, have proper executive functions in their brain. There's a whole industry that's come up. Many industries that come up, and people find ways to make profit off of that. And so there's this very strange, dark truth about this cascades that you're talking about. How do we get toxins out of our body? Medicine could spend the next 30 years doing medicine and figuring out that. They would make money going up and make money going down. So there's a lot of jadedness in the community of vaccine risk aware Americans about how it's almost a defeatism. What steps do you suggest that we take? I already gave one, which is when I talk to the public officials, so-called officials, the public health servants, I'm going to inform them of their duties. That's an important weapon in our arsenal. But what do we do if there's a corporation that's poisoning our water? Let's go with that example.
Well, I think what's finally happening now, this is a golden moment. I know some of the work of Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson said, "Depend on it, sir. When a man knows he is to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully." In other words, we are at a point now where people finally recognize that something is radically wrong, and people are beginning to understand what you're saying. So that if you and I and people like us begin to go to the state legislatures and we begin to show them how they've been made fools of, I mean, all of us know, every one of us knows that there were no weapons of mass destruction before we went into Iraq.
Right.
That's true of all of the wars that took place after World War II. When I was young, when I was just a kid, I heard about the Korean War. Well, people now are beginning to see the Korean War for what it was, absolute foolishness, as was the Vietnam War, as was the destruction of democracies around the world. I point out in the article ending Corporate Tyranny that some of the most wonderful people in the world, including Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba was a tall, slender, elegant man who became the first prime minister, democratically elected prime minister of the Congo. The Congo had just finished with 70 years of the most horrendous treatment by the Belgian king, the king of Belgium. And he Patrice Lumumba, because he began to show independence and because he began to show that the people of the Congo were entitled to control their own resources, when he began to do that, we in the United States began to plot his murder. The President of the United States sent a poisoner out to end his life. We were very much involved in his assassination, and the rulers of the Congo ever since have been corrupt. That same item has occurred in South America, in Central America. That, in other words, it's now so clear. It's so clear that when we go to the legislatures and we say to them, "You're being played for fools. In order for you to stop it, you're going to have to create an office of your own, a state office of foreign policy analysis, so that you don't send your children off to war to keep dying for the benefit of corporate dementia, corporate profits." So here we are we're at that place where there's no question about it. The truth will out, and 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 I practiced law, and I have and always had someone who I considered to be the finest lawyer in the United States ever, maybe one of the finest lawyers in the world, and that was Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln, in his 1862 message to Congress, talked about the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate for the stormy present. And so the result is that we must think anew and disenthrall ourselves. Only then shall we be able to save our country. And what I take that to mean now is that only then shall we be able to save our world.
Yeah.
Well, when he says dogmas of the quiet past, he's talking about extolling the virtue of liberty overall, extolling the virtue of corporate dominance overall, extolling the virtues of market. Let the market determine what's to be done. Well, that's a dogma that we have to face, and we have to disenthrall ourselves because we're at the point of an emergency. We have to disenthrall ourselves. So even the most conservative among us have to begin to understand that we're at the point where we have to change the focus. And I want to say that we have to talk to the conservatives in the language that they understand, using the consternation of Abraham Lincoln. And I just want to talk about one individual in particular. Gordon Durnil, Durnil, wrote a book called The Making of a Conservative Environmentalist. Durnil traced his ancestors back to 1201 in England, when one of his relatives was the sheriff of London. And his people began to settle in Indiana in the late 1700s. Durnil was an environmentalist. He looked carefully at what was happening. He looked at what Rene Dubos was saying was occurring to Americans. And after carefully examining the evidence, he concluded that persistent toxic substances in the environment are probably interfering with human development, beginning at the embryonic age. In addition to being the cause of increases in diseases like cancer, there is more than enough evidence, he says, to conclude the toxins are bringing on neurological problems, learning deficiencies, behavioral abnormalities, reproductive failures, and suppression of immune systems. And then he says, in a plea that everyone can understand, if conservatives believe in individual rights, shouldn't the insidious invasion of our bodies by harmful unsolicited chemicals be considered the most flagrant violation of our individual rights? And he goes on to say, the future of the world is in the hands of people willing to take a stand on these matters. Willing to take a stand on these matters. So Durnil speaks for societies that have developed for purposes of churning out the propaganda year in and year out for conservative values of liberty over everything. And I say, isn't it time that we talk to those people and saying, no, it's time for duty above all, the duties that we would impose on each other in the domestic violence clause and in the criminal laws. So there are universities that are based upon religious concepts that talk in terms of liberty above all. And I say, no, it's duty above all. Listen to Gordon Durnell. And so I think that matters can be changed, and the most conservative operations in the country, the most conservative, have to understand that it's time for them to change their tune and talk about duty, and the duty comes from the domestic violence clause and the various criminal laws that we have to put into effect. And what's interesting is I've done a lot of studying about religion, and I think that divinity studies are a very significant factor, because there's a divine focus that we all have when we think about life and death. And whether you believe in God or don't believe in God, we're part of a community of the world that must understand that we have to live to love and protect one another, as opposed to living to make profits off one another.
Well, I think you'll appreciate that the issues, as complex as they are, I believe part of, and I'll send you my article on this, part of the problem is that we tend to think of risk-benefit as opposed to balance of risks. So if we have confronted with a problem, we're all very comfortable in thinking of what's the benefit to me and what's the risk to me. What's the benefit to, then we can extend it to our families, we can extend it to our school or society, we can, our community and to our nation. We can think risk benefit, but we're very, very bad at thinking in terms of balance of risk. So you have two equally bad solutions, flip a coin, it's fine. But if we really don't understand the complexities of the trade-offs of the balance of risks, then if you adopt the risk-benefit solution, you end up destroying society. And I think a historical analysis of past societies that have failed, if you look at them as failing to understand the nature of the problem that they're in, it's like having a boat that's flooding and there's a hole in the stern and there's a hole in the bow of the boat, in the hull, in both, right? And you're only going to bail out the front. It's not going to work. You have to have double effort, equal effort. And you have to handle both problems. And how do you do that? Well, you mentioned it earlier. You said we have the problem of national security, the wars, projecting our interests, our economic interests, opening new markets, this kind of thing. But at the same time, we have the cost of war, and that money is being spent, and we're not taking care of chemically induced intoxication of our nation, and the decrements in our intellectual capacity, or the decrements of our executive functions. There's a balance of risk, and how do you have your cake and eat it too? Well, obviously we have to have national defense, but we don't necessarily have to invade a country and promote. We have to do. There's hard work. It takes hard work to power a country the size of the United States of America, unless we can get easy access to the oil in Iraq. And broker the contracts the way that we want them. They didn't go to protect the people. The first thing that they did was go to protect the oil whales. There are people in the United States that currently agree. They still think that because it's a total benefit to us, all they see is the benefit. We should invade whatever country we want. We could be and continue to be an imperial entity, a capitalist imperial entity. Taking over the parts of the world, because that's the easy way. But sometimes doing things the hard way and the ingenious way and the clever way is much more rewarding. We have to start thinking in terms of long term. We have to start thinking not in terms of 20 years, but in terms of 200 years, like our founding fathers did. And you're a thinker like that, Michael, and I congratulate you on that. And for bringing this forward, I'm so grateful. The question is, corporate tyranny, is domestic violence clause, the solution, should resonate. We live in a world right now where people give 15 seconds of attention to issues. And I think everyone should really study this problem. Everybody should read your article, read the links to the articles, understand what their duties are to act in terms of not just self-interest, but in terms of the interest of the species and the entire planet. So I really thank you for that, Michael.
Can I just make one further comment?
Oh, yeah.
I think we have to get to the point where we talk in terms of duty, as you say, but the duties are not only to ourselves. We act as though we own the world. We don't own the world. The way the American Indians talked about it, we simply have borrowed it from future generations. And it's that obligation that we have to future generations as opposed to shareholders.
And it's not a debt. It's not a debt. It's an investment. Our goals should be, we should teach our children that you only have this earth for about 70, maybe 80 years to share with other people. And it's your duty to leave it in a better condition than in which you found it. Not just to break even, okay, we're going to save as much, we're going to conserve as much. You should leave the earth and the planet in a better condition. That's a tall order, and that's what I'm saying. You can't solve it with risk-benefit. You have to look in terms of balance of risk. And once you apply the balance of risk, you realize that the losses, your gains are somebody else's losses. Now, how do you handle that without just becoming depressed because you don't know how to solve it? That's what happens to the brain, the human brain. You get depressed. You become angry. You resort to emotion. And then you become selfish. And you go, well, screw it. I can't solve this, so I'm going to get mine. That's what happens. What we have to do is we have to think in terms of 200 years, thousands of years.
Well, I'm so appreciative of your giving me an opportunity to talk about this. And I wanted to thank also Mary Holland and the editors, Chris Agee and Jeremy Kuzmarov at the Covert Action magazine, for allowing a conversation to begin about this that I think is going to go, I know it's going to go to very nice places.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael, it's a pleasure to get to know you and to talk with you about this. We'll have you back again when we can compile some examples of this solution in action, so keep your eyes open for actual solutions being taken up by the people to stand up against corporate tyranny and to bring about solutions in a way that stops the affliction on our bodies and on our minds. And I appreciate you very much, sir. You have a great day.
Thank you.